I was 42 years old, 300 feet below the surface of Lake Tahoe, when I found something that had no business being there. It was tangled in the skeletal remains of an old paddle steamer, a piece of metal so impossibly smooth, so alien, it made the hairs on my neck stand up, even in the freezing water. The thing about deep water is that it doesn't just hide things, it preserves them in the cold and the dark. But the real cold settled in my bones hours later, on the surface. When the Air Force recovery team, not the Coast Guard, the Air Force, boarded my boat and saw my sonar readings, the colonel leading them went completely white. He looked at me as if I'd just uncovered a tomb that was meant to stay sealed forever. Would you have touched it? Let me know in the comments if you'd have the courage, and don't forget to subscribe and tell me what city you're watching from. My name is Caleb Vance. I'm 42 years old, and for more than 20 of those years, Lake Tahoe has been my office. Not the shoreline, not the fancy casinos or the ski resorts that glitter on the mountainsides, but the deep, cold, silent world beneath the surface. I've spent more time in the dark at 300 feet than most people spend in their own backyards. It's a simple life, a routine governed by pressure gauges, oxygen mixes, and the slow, rhythmic beat of my own heart in my ears. I'm a salvage diver. People like Arthur Jennings, the historian, hire me to survey old wrecks. Wealthy clients like Mr. Harrison pay me to find the diamond bracelet his wife dropped off their yacht. The county sheriff calls when a boat goes down, and they need to know why. It's a job of finding things that are lost, of bringing pieces of the sunlit world back from a place that never sees the sun. That day started like any other Tuesday in late September. The air was crisp, carrying the first hint of winter and the smell of pine. I was up before dawn, running through my pre-dive checklist with a religious focus. Every valve, every seal, every battery level checked and double-checked. My old partner, a good man named Marcus Thorne, taught me that. He used to say the lake doesn't forgive complacency. He was right. Complacency is what got him killed 10 years ago, a faulty regulator that we should have caught. I've never made that mistake since. My contract for the day was a simple one. A routine structural survey of the Times SS Commerce, an old paddle steamer that sank in a blizzard back in 1895. I knew her bones like the back of my hand. I dived on that wreck at least 50 times. It was familiar territory, a ghost I knew well. The job was supposed to be easy. A few hours in the water, download the data, file the report, and be home in time for dinner. The descent was smooth. The world of blues and greens on the surface gave way to a deep, inky blackness. At 300 feet, the water is a constant 39 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a cold that seeps into you, a pressure that reminds you that you're a visitor in a place you don't belong. My world shrank to the cone of light from my helmet and the steady green glow of my dive computer. The silence was absolute, broken only by the gentle hum of my scooter and the sound of my own breathing, amplified in my helmet. I reached the wreck of the Commerce, its skeletal wooden ribs reaching up from the silt like the carcass of some ancient beast. Everything was exactly as it should be. I began my survey, letting the side-scan sonar on my scooter paint a digital picture of the decay, moving along the port side just as planned. But then, something flickered on the edge of my screen. About 50 yards past the stern of the ship, where the lakebed was supposed to be nothing but silt and a few scattered granite boulders, the sonar painted a shape that made no sense. It was a hard, sharp return, a geometrically perfect line in a world of soft, natural curves. It wasn't a rock. Rocks don't have 90-degree angles. It wasn't debris from the Commerce. It was too dense, too solid. My contract was the ship. My brain, the part that cared about getting paid, told me to ignore it. Log it as an unidentified geological feature and move on. But the diver in me, the part that lives for the unknown, couldn't let it go. That little voice, the one that's kept me alive all these years, whispered that this was important. I broke from my survey pattern and nudged the scooter's joystick, steering myself away from the familiar wreck and into the deeper darkness. The shape grew clearer on the sonar as I approached. It was wedged between two massive boulders, almost as if it had slammed into them. I slowed the scooter to a crawl, my knuckles white on the controls. The beam from my helmet light sliced through the darkness, and then it hit something. The light didn't scatter or get absorbed the way it does on rock or rotted wood. It reflected. It threw back a clean, sharp gleam of metallic gray that was utterly alien in this environment. My heart, which had been beating in a slow, steady rhythm, started hammering against my ribs. I was 100 yards from the commerce, in a section of the lake bed I thought I knew. And I was looking at something that wasn't on any chart, something that shouldn't exist. My job was to document history, but I had the chilling, gut-wrenching feeling that I was about to find something that had no history at all. The professional in me took over, but the man inside was terrified. What would you have done? Turned back to the safety of the known wreck, or pushed forward into the darkness? Let me know in the comments if you'd have the courage to keep going. And don't forget to subscribe and tell me what city you're watching from. The ascent was the longest 30 minutes of my life. Every foot of water I put between myself and that object felt like a mile. My mind was a chaotic storm of questions. What was it? How long had it been there? Who put it there? When my head finally broke the surface, the familiar sight of the Sierra Nevada mountains ringing the lake felt alien, like I was looking at a world I no longer fully understood. I scrambled back onto my boat, the undertow, and stripped off my gear with shaking hands, my movements clumsy and rushed. I didn't even bother to properly stow my hoses. I just needed to be out of that wetsuit, to feel the crisp air on my skin, to remind myself I was back in the world of the living. But the cold I felt wasn't from the water anymore. It was a deeper chill, a primal fear of the unknown. I fired up the generator and went straight to the small cabin, my laptop already open on the chart table. I plugged in the sonar's data drive and the waterproof camera. My hands trembled as I clicked through the files, first the sonar logs. There it was again, a clean, impossibly perfect shape against the noisy, organic clutter of the lake bed. The software I use can analyze material density based on the sonar return. I ran the diagnostic. Rock, silt, and water all have predictable signatures. The wood of the commerce had its own soft, porous signature. This thing was off the charts. The density was higher than tungsten, denser than any commercially known alloy. It was a digital ghost, a reading that my own equipment was telling me shouldn't be possible. Then I opened the photos. The high-resolution images were even more disturbing than seeing it in person. In the sterile light of my cabin, away from the distorting effect of the water, the details were terrifyingly clear. The surface wasn't just smooth, it was seamless. There were no rivets, no welds, no bolts. It looked like it had been formed from a single piece of metal. It was a 15-foot-long, curved fragment, like a piece of a wing, but with an aerodynamic shape that didn't match any aircraft I'd ever seen, historical or modern. And the symbols, I zoomed in on them. They were etched into the surface with microscopic precision. They weren't letters or hieroglyphs. They were complex geometric patterns, interwoven with lines and arcs that seemed to pulse with an intelligence I couldn't comprehend. They felt less like a language and more like a circuit diagram. I spent 20 years finding things that belonged to our world. Sunken boats, lost jewelry, pieces of history. This belonged to somewhere else entirely. I knew I was out of my depth, literally and figuratively. This wasn't a job for a salvage diver. This wasn't something you report on a standard insurance form. My first instinct was to delete the files, to go back to my apartment, pour a stiff bourbon, and pretend the whole thing never happened. Forget I ever saw it. But Marcus Thorne's face flashed in my mind. He died because of a detail we overlooked, a piece of equipment we failed to properly check. Ignoring this felt like the same kind of negligence, but on a scale I couldn't even imagine. This was a piece of an unknown machine sitting at the bottom of a major freshwater reservoir. I had a responsibility, so I made a call. Not to 911, not to the sheriff, I called my contact at the Coast Guard, a guy named Lieutenant Commander Evans. He's a good man, by the book. I've worked with him on a dozen recovery operations. I kept it simple. I told him I'd found an unidentified submerged object during a survey dive, something that wasn't on any charts, and looked like wreckage from an experimental aircraft. I told him the coordinates and said the material was unusual. He said he'd send a cutter to rendezvous at the marina in 2 hours. 2 hours later, I was tied up at my slip, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. But it wasn't the white and orange hull of a Coast Guard cutter that pulled into the marina. It was 2 black, unmarked SUVs and a heavy-duty transport truck that looked like it belonged on a military base. 6 men in black tactical gear, armed with rifles, got out and secured the dock before I could even process what was happening. Then, a man in a crisp Air Force uniform stepped out of the lead SUV. He had Colonel's eagles on his shoulders and a face that looked like it was carved from granite. He walked straight onto my boat without asking permission. "Caleb Vance?" he asked. It wasn't a question. "I'm Colonel Sterling. We understand you found something for us." He didn't say hello, didn't introduce himself beyond his rank. His team swarmed my boat, efficient and silent. They weren't interested in maritime protocols or salvage rights. They wanted my sonar logs, my camera, and my dive computer. I handed over the camera. Sterling took it and clicked through the images on the small display. He stopped on the close-up of the symbols, his expression unreadable. He looked up, not at me, but out towards the deep water, and muttered, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. So it didn't all burn up on entry. My blood ran cold. He knew. He knew what this was. They weren't here to investigate a discovery. They were here to collect something they had lost. Within minutes, they had their own equipment set up on my deck, including a monitor linked to a sophisticated remotely operated vehicle, an ROV. They sent the drone down, using my coordinates. We all watched the monitor, as the ROV's powerful lights cut through the darkness, the grainy image becoming sharper as it approached the target. There it was, looking even more alien on the screen. "Hold position," Sterling ordered the operator. "Extend the manipulator arm. I want a material sample." The operator expertly guided a small metal claw toward the object. The moment the claw's tungsten tip scraped against the dark gray hull, it happened. The strange symbols, dormant for who knows how long, flashed with a faint, ethereal blue light. The light pulsed once, a silent heartbeat in the crushing dark, before fading. A young technician next to me gasped, whispering, "My God!" The colonel didn't flinch. He grabbed a radio from his belt. His voice was low and urgent. "Spectre 1, this is command. Site is confirmed active. We have a Section 11 artifact. Begin full containment protocol." They had a name for it. A protocol. I wasn't the first person to find this. I had just stumbled into a secret they had been keeping buried for a very, very long time. Would you have the courage to try and pull something like that to the surface yourself? Let me know your thoughts, and if you want to hear how deep this secret goes, make sure you subscribe. The words, quote, "containment protocol," hung in the air of my small cabin, colder and heavier than the lake water itself. My boat, the undertow, my sanctuary for 2 decades, was no longer mine. It had become a forward operating base for a ghost operation I had unwittingly activated. Colonel Sterling's team moved with a chilling, practiced efficiency. They weren't just soldiers, they were specialists, each man knowing his role without a single spoken command. One technician was already running diagnostics on the faint energy pulse we'd seen, his screen filled with cascading numbers that meant nothing to me. Another was coordinating with assets I couldn't see, speaking in clipped codes into a satellite phone. "Phase 2 is a go. Deploy the cradle. Subaquatic team is 5 minutes out." I was a prisoner on my own deck, told to stay in the cabin and out of the way. I watched through the window as a larger, unmarked barge, a hulking gray platform, was guided into the marina by two of the black SUVs. It wasn't a salvage vessel. It looked more like a floating dry dock, equipped with a heavy-duty crane and what looked like a sealed containment chamber. They weren't just here to take a sample, they were here to take the whole thing. The sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple, a beautiful, indifferent backdrop to the surreal drama unfolding on my boat. Two more men arrived, not in tactical gear, but in specialized, heavy-duty dry suits. They weren't recreational divers. They looked like they belonged on a mission to the Marianas Trench. They did a final gear check with Sterling, their helmets integrated with communication systems, and then slipped over the side into the black water without a sound. For the next 6 hours I was interrogated. Not in a room with a single light bulb, but right there at my chart table, by a quiet man in a plain suit who had appeared out of nowhere. He introduced himself as Mr. Graves. He never raised his voice. He just asked questions, over and over, circling back on the same details. What time did I leave the dock? What was my exact dive profile? Did I touch the object with anything other than the sonar and camera? Did I take any physical samples? Did I talk to anyone else? His questions were a finely woven net, designed to find any hole in my story, any loose thread that might lead to a leak. I told him the truth. It was all I had. The whole time, I could hear the low thrum of the crane on the barge and the coded chatter on the radios. They were pulling it up from the deep. Finally, just after midnight, Colonel Sterling came back into the cabin. His face was grim. "Mr. Vance, you'll be coming with us." It wasn't a request. Two of his men escorted me off my boat and into the back of one of the SUVs. As we drove away from the marina, I looked back. The undertow was surrounded by a portable security fence, bathed in the cold white light of portable floodlights. It looked like a crime scene. They took me to a temporary command post they'd set up in a rented warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place was a hive of activity, filled with computer terminals and uniformed personnel, all Air Force. This was a full-scale military operation that had materialized out of thin air. In a sterile, windowless room, Mr. Graves slid a stack of papers across a metal table. It must have been 100 pages thick. "Non-disclosure agreement," he said flatly. "You will sign it. It is retroactive to the moment you first saw the anomaly on your sonar. You will forget the coordinates. You will forget the symbols. You will forget this conversation. You will forget Colonel Sterling. And you will forget me. What you found was a piece of a highly classified experimental military drone that went down during a test flight years ago. Its power source is volatile. Your discovery has initiated a national security recovery operation. Is that clear?" I looked at him, then at the papers. The legalese was dense, impenetrable, but the message was crystal clear. Talk, and you disappear. I thought about Marcus. I thought about the life I'd built, the simple solitude of the deep. They were taking that from me, replacing it with a secret I never asked for. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady, but my world was fracturing. I signed where he pointed, page after page, initialing clauses that effectively erased the last 12 hours of my life. When I was done, they took my laptop, my sonar data drive, my dive computer, and my camera. "They'll be returned to you after a thorough data wipe," Sterling told me, his tone leaving no room for argument. "For your safety." They drove me back to my apartment and left me on the curb just before dawn. I walked inside, the silence of my home deafening after the controlled chaos of the operation. I stood at my window, looking out towards the lake, which was now just a dark, placid surface, hiding an incredible truth. The next morning, the news reported that a 2-square-mile section of the lake had been temporarily restricted by the U.S. military for a training exercise involving the recovery of sensitive equipment. A training exercise. They were boxing it up, shipping it out, and burying it under a mountain of paperwork and threats, just as they must have done before. I thought of the colonel's words, the ones he whispered on my boat. So it didn't all burn up on entry. He wasn't surprised to find it. He was surprised that Time Sai had found it. This wasn't a recovery. It was a cleanup. They were retrieving a piece of a puzzle they had been trying to keep scattered for decades. And I had just handed them a corner piece they thought was lost forever. They told me it was a drone. But drones don't have pilots. And as they were loading the sealed container onto a transport truck, I overheard one of the technicians talking to another. His voice was low, shaken. The gamma reading was off the charts, he'd said. But the interior, it was pristine, almost like it was shielded to protect something inside. What were they protecting in the cold, crushing dark at the bottom of a lake? Would you have the courage to try and open something like that? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to hear the rest of the story, make sure you subscribe. They returned my boat a week later. My equipment, the laptop, the sonar drive, the dive computer, came back in a neat box, wiped so clean it was like they'd just come from the factory. There was no note, no final debriefing, just a silent, sterile return to the life I had before. On the surface, everything was exactly as I had left it. But under the surface, in the quiet depths of my own mind, a tectonic shift had occurred. The lake was no longer my office. It was a crime scene. A tomb whose door I had accidentally opened, and which had been slammed shut and sealed again by men in unmarked uniforms. For months I felt their presence. A dark sedan that would appear on my street for a day or two, before being replaced by another, identical one. The faint, almost imperceptible click on my phone line before a call connected. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe that's what they wanted me to think. When you've been shown a monster in the closet, you can't help but see its shadow in every corner of the room. My life, once governed by the simple physics of pressure and time, was now governed by a secret that isolated me more profoundly than any deep-water dive. I couldn't talk to anyone. How could I? Hey, I found a piece of an alien spaceship, but the Air Force took it and made me sign my life away. They'd think I had nitrogen narcosis, that I'd spent too much time in the deep, so I kept diving. It was the only thing I knew. But the joy was gone. The thrill of discovery had been replaced by a gnawing dread. Every sonar return that wasn't a rock or a log made my heart seize. I was no longer looking for history. I was looking over my shoulder. The 2-square-mile restricted zone remained in place for a month. Then the buoys disappeared as quietly as they had arrived. I waited another 2 weeks. Then I went back. I had to. I took the undertow out to the exact coordinates, my stomach in knots. I dropped my most sensitive sonar array into the water and scanned the lakebed where the object had been. Nothing. It wasn't just that the fragment was gone. The 2 massive granite boulders it had been wedged between were gone too. The silt on the lakebed was unnaturally smooth, as if a giant hand had reached down and scraped the bottom of the lake clean, erasing any evidence that anything had ever been there at all. That's when I knew I couldn't let it go. If they were this thorough, this desperate to erase it, then it was more important than I could ever imagine. My search moved from the water to the land, from sonar to archives. I spent my evenings in the dusty basement of the county library, scrolling through decades of local newspapers on microfiche, my eyes burning under the dim light. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. An old plane crash that was never solved. Reports of a strange meteor. Anything that didn't fit. For weeks, I found nothing but local history and forgotten obituaries. And then, I saw it. A tiny article, buried on page 7 of the Tahoe City Tribune, dated July 9, 1947. The headline was small. Local stargazers report green fireball. It was a short piece. Several residents, including a respected local astronomy professor, had reported a brilliant, pulsing green light streaking across the night sky. It appeared to break into several pieces, with the largest one reportedly crashing into the deepest part of the lake. The official explanation, provided by the military a day later, was a rare bolide meteor. A weather event. Nothing to see here. The date hit me like a physical blow. July 9th, 1947. 2 days after the United States Army Air Forces issued a press release stating they had recovered a quote, flying disc from a ranch near Roswell, New Mexico. A story that was famously changed just 24 hours later to a, quote, weather balloon. A weather balloon in the desert. A meteor in the lake. It was the same playbook. The same pattern of denial, of misdirection, of burying the truth under a mundane explanation. Colonel Sterling's words came rushing back. No longer a quiet whisper, but a deafening roar in my mind. So it didn't all burn up on entry. He wasn't talking about some modern drone that fell out of the sky a few years ago. He was talking about an event from over 70 years ago. He knew the story. He knew it had broken apart in the atmosphere. They recovered the main wreckage in the New Mexico desert and told the world it was a balloon. But a piece of it, a crucial piece, had gotten away. It had screamed across 3 states and plunged into the one place on Earth almost as inaccessible and inhospitable as deep space. The bottom of Lake Tahoe. It lay there, preserved in the crushing pressure and the near-freezing dark. A secret kept by 1 million tons of water. Until I, a salvage diver on a routine survey, put my light on it. I wasn't a discoverer, I was an inconvenience. The technician's words about the shielded interior and the gamma radiation, that's the part that keeps me awake at night. That fragment wasn't just a piece of fuselage, it was a containment vessel. It was built to protect something. Drones don't need that kind of protection. But a pilot does. Or a specimen. Something biological. The blue light I saw when their ROV touched it wasn't a malfunction, it was a response. A sign of a system, dormant but not dead, still trying to function after 70 years in the abyss. They didn't just recover a piece of a machine, they recovered something that was waiting. They took my logs, they took the evidence, and they tried to take the memory. They want me to forget. They want all of us to look at the sky and see only planes and stars. They want us to believe the official story, because the truth is too massive, too terrifying to contain. But I was there. I saw it. I touched it. And I know their story is a lie. They didn't find an experimental drone at the bottom of Lake Tahoe. They found the missing piece of Roswell. And you, what do you think was really behind it all? Let me know your theories in the comments. And if you believe that some truths can't stay buried forever, make sure you subscribe. Because I don't think this story is over.